Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Felicia Zamora, and I am the host of this new conversation series through the Department of English at the University of Cincinnati, entitled Poetry as a Catalyst for Radicalization and Liberation for BIPOC and Marginalized People. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to click out of this here so we can see our guest. And I've got to do a couple of things of clicking. All right, so this conversation series really searches for a collective exploration of poetry's role in activism and social change, specifically from contemporary poets whose art directly reflects such inquiries. And I'm honored today to have my guest who's joining us is poet Vanessa Angélica Villarreal. And before we jump into the conversation, let me introduce you a bit to Vanessa. Vanessa Angélica Villarreal was born in the Rio Grande Valley to Mexican immigrants. She is the author of the award-winning collection Beast Meridian from Noemi Press with the Acrylica series in 2017, a recipient of a 2019 Whiting Award, a Kate Tufts Discovery Award nomination, and winner of the John A. Robertson Award for Best First Book of Poetry from the Texas Institute of Letters. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, Paris Review, Poetry Magazine, and elsewhere. She is a recipient of a 2021 National Endowment for the Arts Poetry Fellowship. Yay, congrats! As well as fellowships from Cantamundo and Jack Jones Literary Arts. She's a doctoral candidate in English literature and creative writing at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she's working on a poetry and an essay collection while raising her son. Please help me welcome Vanessa Angélica Villarreal.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to just be talking to you.
Oh, absolutely. And Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing virtual space today. I have questions for you. And before we sort of jump into the questions on social change and your art, how have you been doing the past year, specifically in the pandemic year, which isn't over, right? It's been over a year and we're still in it. But how are you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I think it's so vital that we do these check-ins. I feel like it's made us more attentive to each other's, mental, emotional states, how survival kind of came to the top of everyone's concerns. I'm very lucky to be doing well, as well as one can be. A lot of time to spend with my son, despite not having childcare. A lot of time to be attentive to my work. But I also am contending with a bit of survivor's guilt, knowing that my mother is a grocery worker, an essential worker. I have family who are truck drivers, and the pandemic isn't the only sort of disaster that hit us, right? Like Texas froze over. I've just had to contend with a lot of precarity in my family, and trying to understand what justice means in these new urgent contexts. So yeah, I'm doing well in terms of my work, but in terms of the world, I don't know. I feel like we are on the cusp of something big.
Oh gosh, yeah. I thank you so much for bringing that up, because you're right. Not only are we dealing with a pandemic, but we're dealing with racial violence that feels like this rising. And when you say the cusp of something, one of the poets I was talking to about this, that cusp of something, I want to believe that it's a hopefulness toward, white supremacy kind of raging because it feels at risk. And this idea that you bring up about really thinking about what justice means right now. How do we do that coming out of a pandemic where the world sort of shut itself inside, where our communities, albeit still there, we're no longer in the physicality that we were used to, and how do we build from this moment forward to keep pushing white supremacy to smother it. I mean, really is what I want, is what I'd like to see. So that's something on the cusp of something. I really like that idea. I like it. And even though that there is the violence that's going on with it, that is horrible and hurting and traumatizing, I feel like it has to be working towards something, that the loss of lives aren't for nothing. Well, I'm glad that you are is doing as well as one can be, which is good. I know there's a lot of people who've been suffering, and that suffering still continues on a multitude of fronts. With that, though, would you mind speaking to your thoughts around poetry as activism? Is poetry activism? What do you think about that? And how do you see poetry in relation to social change?
Yeah, so this question was so exciting to me because I am often, I've been doing so much archival research. I'm often surprised to see poetry appear in just like the oddest places. Like right now I'm looking at like colonial botanical drawings, to derive, language. And William Blake like wrote this response to Carl Linnaeus, and just wrote like all these poems about like the lily and the passiflora, and like it's just this poetry book that I didn't even know existed. You think of William Blake, you think of the tiger, and you think of like, I don't know, mystic tripping, um, uh, and here's poetry in this science context. And then you think of people who were seen as activists first, who were actually poets. Like I think of like Eldridge Cleaver, Soul on Ice. I think of June Jordan, contemporary poets like Tongo Eisen Martin, Sonia Sanchez, right? Poetry, is inextricable, I think, from activism. And activism is, I think, like one of these like more liberal understandings of what a revolution is. I don't know if you can hear it, but there's like a mariachi thing happening. It's just like LA neighborhoods. I'm so sorry, but
no, don't apologize. I love it. I think that's something that this virtual world has created for us, is that it exposes the seams of our humanity.
Yeah, well, and then you're gonna hear the paletero. He has like a little honking device on his cart, and yeah, so that's about to happen. But
well, we're very privileged to have it. I think.
What was I talking about? Oh yeah, so I think we think of activism as organizing. It's connected to charity, it's connected to donations, right? You can be an activist from the comfort of your home, whereas the revolution, right, and revolutionary thinking is insurrection, is this like physical action. This it implies a physicality to politics, right? And I think poetry is inherently physical, it's inherently revolutionary language. So like when I think about like, is poetry activism? Like poetry is like the essence of activism. It is the essence of language, right? Like when I think of poetry, poetry is like the polar opposite of like legalese or like marketing business language, right? Because that language is meant to obfuscate, right? It's meant to obscure, it's meant to, I don't know, exploit. Whereas poetry is, it doesn't necessarily have to make sense. It just has to like resonate with something human. It can be an utterance, right? Like we connect to Sappho, the fragments of Sappho, because these utterances are just erotic and like, so if poetry is an essence of language that's not necessarily connected to sense making, right? And sense making is connected to like business and capital and law and structure. poetry is this chaotic form of language that challenges those structures.
Right.
So yeah, poetry is absolutely activism, and we can push language to break down all kinds of barriers, I think.
I absolutely, I love that answer in so many ways. Just this idea of the revolution versus this activism, which we often think can be rather passive, but the revolution has always been physical, and in language is a physicality, but poetry even more so ramps that up. Like I love how you're thinking about it, because for me, I really do see also that poetry, when we create and we create this experience, right, that isn't meaning making, that's not necessarily its goal, right? It's to create an experience, to move emotion, it's to interact with a reader in a way that we don't know what that interaction is going to look like. And so in some ways we put the art into the world, having to believe that it will influence someone's thinking,
Mm-hmm.
someone's perspective. And isn't that like the epitome, if you really drill down to what activism is? It's about persuasion, or changing someone's ideas, or getting them to mobilize or to do something. And for me, I think that the art and the language in which it comes from, you know, I always think of the English language as a, a big fucking failure, because I mean, language is kind of a failure, but it's a beautiful failure, because, it's like the word phone is never going to be the phone, right? Like the whole sort of idea. So we start off with failure, but
Yeah.
we embrace that failure because it's a connective tissue in the bodies of our thinking, in the bodies of our working in the space together. And so I loved your answer.
Yeah, no, I actually am so glad that you talked about how English is a failure. It reminds me of Adorno. Of course, I'm in this like dissertation space, so like everything connects to everything in this like really weird, chaotic way. But Adorno said, concepts do not fit neatly into their boxes or like their words. Like essentially, like here's a concept, right? That has no language or a feeling. Like Virginia Woolf said that like the English language can tell us the story of Hamlet, but it can't tell us the shiver of a headache, right? Like the inherent failure of language is essentially like that space between the concept and the word is where creation is, right? And so yeah, that's when we start. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is the way that language can carry this other charge other than like what it means,
Yeah.
right? So like if you say, like you used the example phone, right? That connects to like so many different contexts to so many different people, right? So like phone, like I connect that to like calling cards and like, calling other countries and like, buying them at like gas stations and, like my first pager and like cricket phones, right? Because I'm a zennial, I guess. I'm like I'm an elderly millennial. I had a beeper.
You're a beeper. Oh, nice.
Right. And I read recently that kids don't know what this is. When they do the hand gesture for phone, they do this.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea.
Right.
I'm
So
a
like this word is evolving,
mm,
according to its context, and as it moves through time, language also evolves through time, or it starts to really fail, right? Like outdated language, problematic language, like this movie hasn't aged well. This word was okay to use and now it's no longer okay to use. Like language can be like points on a timeline where we can connect, you know like, or expose structural injustice,
mm,
because if certain slurs were okay to use in the 70s and the 20s and the 1800s, and they're no longer, adequate, they're offensive even, right? What does that tell us about the structures that we lived in? And how can we excavate, the humanity and the injustice that, our people survived, having to just deal with the violence of language,
Right.
right? And so poetry, like a lot of the poetry that I'm doing now, is looking at historical instances of language, supposedly neutral language, right? Like scientific language, medical language, the language of documents, legal documents, right? And exposing, you know, how people were categorized and the violence of categorization, the violence of classification, the way a border, is basically built by language. It's not really in the earth, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, what were we talking about? We were talking about the failure of English, right? And how concepts don't fit into their words.
Yeah, I love that. Concepts don't fit into their words. And just the structures of injustice and how language is one of those structures. If we allow it to keep being unjust in the way that we use and wield it, but also, just this idea that in your archival work, like what you're digging at are the roots of things, the violent language that is still being used. I mean, I remember I was reading a poem of mine to students, and one word for me, being Mexican American, has always been, the S word. I use spic a lot in my writing, and I understand it's rewounding for a lot of people, but because it tangents my history, it tangents the way that I have evolved over time. And one of my students actually said, "What an outdated term." And I sat back and I sort of thought about it, and I'm like, wow, like the power behind that word in the way that it degraded me is like, oh, that's not even a derogatory term that's used anymore, is kind of what my students were talking about. And that goes through that time, that mapping, like that time pointing mapping of where language, even violent language, and I guess not just even violent language, I mean, we sort of hold up like, what is the language of wounding right now? You can map that and you can sort of understand what that structural injustice through language has looked like over time.
Yeah.
And how do we change it?
So I actually think that spic is being used still. So it actually happened really recently on Twitter for me. It was right around the time of the insurrection, the
Oh
January
my God.
insurrection. I tweeted something completely not connected to, the insurrection at all. And this white man just left that word as a comment. And a friend of mine, responded like, what is this, like 1965? And I was like, no, actually, growing up in Texas, that word is very common and it's
Yes.
still used,
Yes.
which speaks to, I think, the exceptional sort of state of being Mexican American in Texas, especially, but red states along the border.
Yeah.
There is a different charge that language has in these regions, right? And language, as we know, is geographic. It's not just cultural, and it's not just like do you speak French or whatever. Like it's connected to geography, and the border, being this highly volatile space, right? It charges language in a different way. But you ask, like, what is this language of wounding? I think spic is being hidden, like just like Mexican American has sort of been swallowed up by whiteness, right? Is being swallowed up by whiteness. So is the racism that we have lived, endured, that we, it's almost like this, like gaslighting, where if Mexican American is being swallowed by whiteness, being consumed by whiteness, then we don't have any language to point to, except we do. We have, concerns about, reproduction, right? Like, there was like this Texas Tribune article that was like, 3 Hispanic kids are being born to every 1 white child in Texas, right? Like there's this concern of invasion, right? Which was the El Paso shooters' motive, right, for shooting up the Walmart. There is this, even just the term illegal, right? undocumented, right, has this charge. You don't have to create a slur if legal language, if,
Mhm.
like journalistic language carries the charge. So we're back to this English as failure, right? Because slurs, I don't even think slurs are that important anymore. I think it's about identifying these like walls that language creates where it's harder to see,
Yeah.
where the injustice is. So another part of my research is looking at outcomes. If we can't identify, racism in who, is called a slur or, you know, um, there are all these arbitrary, ways that we determine what race is or what oppression is. Let's look at outcomes, right? Let's look at outcomes for different, cultural, racial, ethnic groups. Let's look at citizenship. Let's look at immigration law. Um, you know, and also looking at history, right? Like the sterilization of, the Mexican women that went to the Supreme Court, Madrigal versus Quilligan, right? Um, and the fact that, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of USC Medical. They ruled in favor of the doctors who sterilized them without their knowledge or consent, right? The issue there was also a language barrier. The doctors and the hospital speaks English and the mothers speak Spanish, right? They are given contracts that they can't translate. That is already obfuscated language in terms of medical legal language,
Mhm.
right? So like yes, slurs matter and slurs are, contextual and they're painful, but like the culture and the law and the structure around the slur
Yeah.
can make it disappear, but all the structures stay the same,
Yeah.
right? um and so yeah, that's, you have to start, finding evidence.
Mm.
The poet becomes like a kind of detective,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Looking at the crime scene essentially of history,
Mhm.
and excavating, what we survived, right? Um,
Wow, this idea of the crime scene of history is absolutely nailing it in this idea of what we have to not only excavate and expose and reveal and constantly hold up and say, here is this. No. uh how do we find different ways of doing things? How do we find different structures? How do the structures that we have are, and one argues that our structures aren't broken. They're not broken because they fit white supremacy just fine. One would argue that white supremacy doesn't think that English is a failure because it's meant for white supremacy. But those of us who are taking a look at it and really know and have felt it, BIPOC, trans queer individuals, people with disabilities, all these marginalized people, we understand that it's all failures and these structures are failures as well.
mhm.
How do we get to a point where we try to build something different, where our voices and our bodies are welcome? And that's gonna take a lot. It is taking a lot. But again, I go back to that on the precipice of something that you spoke of, that's sort of what I'm feeling. And I sure hope that that's what it is. I think this is actually a great segue for us to go to the next question, which actually has specifically to do, brings in Beast Meridian a bit. This book is such a powerful book for me. It's such an important book in my thinking on this research about poetry as activism, about social change, because in Beast Meridian, there is such precision and such attention. As Khadija Queen said, it's a fierce incantation, for me, to the borderlands, to brown bodies, to the archaeology of memory, which I think is a term in here, to carving an existence, but also this refusing of the word parallax. This parallax, which was that fantastic word that gets turned inside out in one of your assimilation rooms poems, that the effect of positioning upon reviewing an object. You know, your poems are really this incantation to being the object, to being labeled beast. And what does that mean? They seek both, in my opinion, an elegy, but also a revealing of what people of color, but also specifically what Mexicans and Latinx people endure in the physicality and the mentality of this world. But in that is the power of our imaginations. We are our own stars. And I just want to read one piece on page 79. Lopez, Praying Herd, Requiem. Draw a line through our scattered bodies. The meadow reveals our constellation. For me, there's so much communion in these poems. And so I am curious, you know, I know how I see your art, and I'm curious on how you see social change manifesting in your art and in the processes, in your creative processes. It was a lot. I'm sorry.
No, it's not a frustrated sigh. It's a how much time you got sigh.
You like that sigh.
First of all, thank you so much for that beautiful and powerful reading. I really appreciate the attentiveness to the pauses that you put there, and how meaning can be created syllable by syllable. I was trying to be attentive to that, and just thank you for seeing it. I had so many thoughts as you were phrasing your question that I lost a lot of them. So let me try to build back to where I wanted to go. Let's see. When I wrote Beast Married, you know, this book continues to reveal itself to me. I know that sounds really strange, but I think of poetry as a kind of channeling, you know, a kind of channeling with my dead. One of my biggest anxieties is, you know, this archival anxiety. The maternal side of my family is disappearing. Like any evidence that they existed is disappearing. I can't find them in like Mexican records, Catholic, you know, census rolls, nothing. I can't, like my mom only exists in the US. You know, my grandmother had to flee with, you know, her two children, and then she crossed over, and then my mom and uncle came over unaccompanied. And so my mom, I can't find her birth certificate. So if she were ever deported, she's, you know, not a citizen yet. You know, she has a green card, but under Trump, that even that was threatened, right? She would come back stateless. She would not be able to claim citizenship in Mexico. She's, you know, she would be a stateless person. You know, my grandmother does not exist. I've asked my mom over and over, did she change her name? Did she, you know, and she's like, no, this is her name, you know, as far as my mom knows. And this is because, you know, both sides of my family, but specifically my mom's side, we're descended from cotton laborers who were unpaid, you know, they lived on the land, they did this labor. You know, this is a history that we don't know about, you know, these like Spanish, you know, essentially cotton plantations, these ranchos, you know, and as this history becomes more and more subsumed under law and language and nation and nationalism and, you know, documents and social security numbers, and, you know, the archive that's being built is like already so empty, and it's already like excising entire families, people, right? And so, you know, when I started writing this book, I was like, these are people who are already, you know, invisible, are already criminalized, are already, you know, stigmatized. And when they leave, when they die, you know, I was going through this period where just a family member was like constantly, you know, either being deported or dying, or, you know, and especially elders, that I was like, no one's going to remember them. And so, but that was also so connected to this period of loss, you know, that I went through within the institution of, like, you know, the school and, you know, at-risk youth, especially in the 90s, like tough love was like a very, like, you know, zero tolerance, like all of the stuff. So I became immediately criminalized. And that, I wasn't sure how it connected to this disappearing family until, you know, it felt like a critique of structure and the erasure of memory, right? Memory is an inherently political landscape. Who gets remembered, how you are remembered, who gets to even exist in an archive, exist in a record, right? And archiving is inherently political. Who, you know, gets to make the decisions, you know, for what gets remembered, what gets, you know, filed away. So, you know, all of these excisions exist. And especially, you know, I think for people who are colonized and who are facing this, you know, erasure from all sides, you know, you don't have this way of rebuilding a family tree. You don't have this way of, like, knowing your history. You exist kind of stranded in time. You are stranded in time and space. And, you know, I wrote about this in a recent article for Oxford American about my dad's music career, you know, about how the borderlands is full of futureless people and how futurelessness, right, is an inherently racialized condition. So if you have no past and you have no future, you become this unit that is primed for labor, right, and exploitation. Futurelessness is inherently a way of racializing you and stripping you of power. I promise I'm getting back to the book.
No, please keep going. Like, perfect.
And so the only way I felt so guilty because I felt like I was inventing, you know, these histories of, you know, my ancestors, because I would do this practice. And actually, Ingrid Contreras Rojas just wrote about self-mesmerism for the New York Times. And this is what I was doing. I was listening to this, like, very, like, entrancing music, William Basinski, Philip Glass, trying to suspend the sense-making part of my brain that wants to control language, that wants to organize language, and channel something more directly from my subconscious and try to tap into the cenote, right? What Gloria Anzaldúa called the cenote, which is this space not only of the subconscious, but also of collective memory, collective knowledge. Now, I didn't know I was doing this at the time. I was like, oh, I'm just going to listen to some black metal and like, or like, like get myself in this like really weird state. And now I know, and Gloria Anzaldúa isn't the only person who thought and wrote about the cenote. Freud wrote about like the magic, what's it called? The magic pad. I'll look it up later. But essentially the subconscious, or like Edward Said, right? The trace. We all carry the traces of history, the traces of memory are embodied, right? So any kind of history that you're trying to access, you carry it. You are the archive. You are the walking archive, right? Because those records have been erased, right? Excuse me. Someone is calling me about my car warranty. These records have been erased, right? But the effects on our body and on our memory, you know, exist. And that's when you start getting into like epigenetics and all of these things, embodied trauma, generational trauma, and tapping into it. What is the language that you tap into? Genetic memory, inherited trauma, you know, this history that's disappearing. It's poetry. Poetry is that bridge, you know, and the way poetry can become defamiliarized from that formal language of the document, of the archive, right? It can actually help you reconnect because you are taking language back from sense making, because what has happened to us and is happening to us doesn't make sense. So you access that space through poetry, this language of channeling, this language of communion, communion with memory, with, I don't know, with spirit, you know, not to get too woo. Like I've been trying to like hide my woo and the fact that like, you know.
No, don't hide the woo. No, please don't, because honestly, like there are times in this conversation I wanted to just say it's magic. And it's not, and I'm not saying magic as like a metaphor. I'm saying it as truly there is something inside our bodies where the memories that we can't comprehend through language and can't even quite understand are hidden inside of us, like a genetic code that only we are able to decipher. And so when you said that you like had, you're tapping into perhaps what feels like imagination, like imagination helps us to rebuild inside that which is unknown. And I'm saying this because I mean, I'm estranged from the Mexican culture because my dad was from Mexico. He was adopted by a Mexican family in Texas, the Zamoras, who I have no documentation, no trace of. I have seen one picture of my father, and I think I lost it. I actually just wrote I have an essay coming out that's about poetry in the cellular, about the first time I encountered this picture of my father. And it was like looking at myself because I look just like him, and yet I've never met him. And I grew up in an all white household besides my brother and sister and I, the three of us, these three brown kids in the middle of Iowa, the middle of white Iowa. and and this idea of that there's traces of us inside us in a lineage that goes way beyond me, goes way beyond the Zamoras, it goes way beyond my father. It goes into something ancestral that I don't fully understand, and I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to listen to the ebbs and flows of what's not there, of a history that has been, and you talk about this, you know, who gets to exist, a history of erasure. If you have a lineage of erasure, how do you piece your becoming, and how do you piece the future?
Right.
There are at times where I have felt like the only thing that I am good for is being treated like a workhorse. And I realize that like that's language that has been you know, that's the colonized thinking inside me, that's the internalized oppression from when I, you know, how am I decolonizing myself? Like this is an important process for me. And I think that it really is really a lot of how we're, like, we as artists are trying to approach our relationships with poetry and with our art. You just did such one, and so what? So to go back to, you know, don't hide your woo. That's fun.
No, I actually wanted to respond so much about like this idea that, you know, you didn't have anything, you know, to point back to look back on, you know, and you know, this has been so present with me. I recently, you know, wrote a poem in response to Webb Du Bois's pictorial graphs. A lot of people aren't familiar with them, but essentially he compiled data that didn't exist about Black life in America, right? Like, home ownership, this mundane stuff that there was no data for,
Yeah.
but he painted these like, they were very conceptual
Yeah.
graphic illustrations. They're loaded with this affect, right? With this like emotion outside of the data,
Mhm.
right? And if you look at the colors, like, you can sense mourning, you can sense injustice, you can sense violence, you can
Mm.
sense community, you can sense, and you're looking at like home ownership,
Yeah.
like, um, and he found it important to rebuild an archive, or create a counter archive,
Mhm.
in response to erasure, a counter public, right, of witness, of people who have witnessed, and empower them to create their own records, their own archives, right? Because, especially in Black studies is so foundational to how we think about, race and futurelessness and history, and, not being connected to an origin, right? A lineage. It's foundational to my thinking. And, I think, especially, that work with Du Bois, if you create this counter archive, you are in communion in the most basic sense of the word, right? You are engaging with community, the data and facts of the community as they experience it, and communion with an ancestor in the sense that you are setting the record straight,
Yeah.
right? You are reclaiming data from the nothing of white supremacy, right? Because whiteness is the absence of memory. It's tabula rasa, right? Whiteness is what replaces memory. So when you take back your data, when you take back your history, that is inherently revolutionary,
Yeah.
you know? Um, so yeah, I just wanted to let you know, like, write all of that stuff about your dad. You'll get him back.
Yeah. And it feels like this taking back, this reclamation, this like reclamation from the void at times, or the reclamation from I agree, like um Black radicalization is like the foregrounding for all marginalized people in this country, and specifically in the arts. For me, I mean, it's where I turn to, because I feel like that is a grounding and an understanding of what it really means for to have a future, to see a future, and to use imagination to carve that future, which is a question that I have. I know we don't have a ton of time, but I'm really interested in what do you think is the role of imagination in the arts when it comes to this invention and radicalization of our world?
Yeah, I am so in love with the word imagination and imagining. I was gonna like sort of like glibly tweet like, what the world could look like if we didn't have borders. And it was like the Star Trek world with like, the spaceship and, like speedy communication and like, the way we envision Star Trek world, or like Star Wars worlds, where like entire planets, that's the culture. Like, it's not split up by, well, maybe Naboo is, but we're not talking about.
I love that you just geeked out for a moment.
Oh yeah, you
got
only have to talk to me for about 5 minutes, and I'm like, so Game of Thrones, like, it's it's absurd. But and actually, we'll have another conversation about how fantasy and science fiction helps us inherently understand colonialism.
Oh yes, please.
And race. But yeah, I think Latinx futurisms, indigenous futurisms, and especially, Afrofuturism gives us a sense of how to imagine futures absent of or free from the trap of not only colonialism and race, but literally Western consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Our consciousness as a human, like, um, animal essentially
Mhm.
changed with Western consciousness, right? The way we think about science and religion as separate. We think of, medicine and poetry as separate. Like there are hierarchies, inherent, ways of thinking of certain information and language as valid and others as not valid, right? Like masculine is, logical, rational. Feminine is like intuitive, and everything is inherently made dualistic.
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking is leading us to an apocalypse. It's literally extracting, resources, putting us in this precarious state as a species that is connected to all the other species, all the other, like, to the land
Yeah.
essentially. And you know part of the work that we're doing as poets is reclaiming a consciousness that is our birthright, that is outside of Western consciousness, that defies hierarchies.
Yep.
Um, you're not just decolonizing poetry, you're literally reclaiming the possibilities of how we think about the world, right?
Yeah.
You're reclaiming, um, connecting these dots between the land and medicine, the land and religion, the land and food, and getting rid of scarcity, right? Scarcity as this product of Western consciousness. So when I think of like imagining futures, there's this way that I think about how language can be this conduit for like coming back to the land and coming back to each other.
Yeah.
Um, and how language can challenge, the border, because the border is created by language. Nations are created by language. Power is created by language. What as poets can we do to recognize those structures and start to push against them, so that we like pull back the curtain on the wizard, right? On the Wizard of Oz, and reclaim the dream consciousness, right, of our animal.
Yeah.
I know this sounds so wild, but
No, it actually doesn't, because, okay, I'm following you, and it's largely, I have a lot of the same thoughts and inclinations and feelings about this, that, we're a natural being in a natural world. And the more we've been ripped from our naturalness to believe that we are special, it has removed us from the generous and light way that we need to move within the world and within each other. Like our disconnection from our naturalness is part of the reason we are disconnected from each other as a species, as a human species. Like we forget that, what we have, we have marsh gases in our stomach. We have the same dust in our bones that the first comets that went across the sky. Like, if we can just see ourselves as not being special, of this idea that, we are that of nature. We are nature. We are the dirt. We are the wind. We are the taste of uh, the leaves on the leaves. And if we could remember that connectivity, that being part of something greater, I don't think we would have, this gorging violence toward each other through language or through the things that connect us. So I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but like, in thinking we're not special, this going against Western thought of hierarchy and consciousness, we begin to get into limitlessness. We begin to the liminal spaces where borders can't exist. The ridiculousness of borders, the idea that a border surrounds anything. The body's not a border, it's permeable.
yeah, like, so what I'm kind of hinting at is this sort of burgeoning field of animal studies, and specifically Black feminist thinking, beginning with Sylvia Wynter and Catherine McKittrick and Zakiya Iman Jackson. These are foundational thinkers for me, and exposing even just the concept of the human,
Mm.
right? As a way of creating dehumanized people who are also human in terms of like species, if you want to think of species, right? Human is inherently Western. It's
Yep.
inherently part of like this like liberal consciousness. So even when you say human rights, you're
Yeah.
still creating, you know, this differentiation. So if we sort of
Yeah.
get away from humanness and begin to think of ourselves as animal, because we think of our of you know marginalized people as animal anyway, right? Beast meridian. We think of migrants, these migrant caravans in border surges as these like, you know, they use the language of infestation of, you know,
Yeah.
pests. um, if marginalized people, indigenous people, you know, Black people are seen as, you know, animal, then maybe that is the path to liberation. Maybe
Mm.
that, you know, like maybe the human, that as a structure itself is a border.
Yeah.
Um, and so, and, you know, being animal, reclaiming our animal is a way of reclaiming the land, um, connecting back to the land. I love animal studies. It's so fascinating. I highly, highly recommend Zakia Iman Jackson's new book, whose title has just escaped me. um, but essentially, it's, you know, thinking about anti-Blackness, you know, and animal studies as a way out of, you know, this foundational structure of anti-Blackness. Um, yeah. So,
Oh my God. Well, and thank you. Like this idea of human as a structure, um, you know, it is itself is like Western consciousness, and is not the way out of the, you know, is not the way out of where we're at right now. Is it's just it's phenomenal thinking. It's thinking that really is pushing into a realm of what who are we, and who are we in relation to the self, the others of our species, our animalness, our environment, our consciousness. Like that is such a larger conversation, but really isn't a larger conversation. It's the conversation.
yeah, I mean, we all know it. I mean, who doesn't feel extremely fucked up going to IKEA? Like, who doesn't feel extremely fucked up at Disney World? Like, you know,
Yeah.
it's a simulacrum, right? Like, you know, when something is false and you should not be there.
Yeah.
Like, that's why we imagine like zombies, like, you know, beating down the windows of the mall, right? Like, it's fucked up to be in Target. I hate
Yeah.
it. Like, it's
I mean, I read this study that like people become paralyzed in the toothpaste aisle because there's too many options for toothpaste, and there's like a ridiculousness to that. Like
well,
if we step back and we look at ourselves as a species of how much our wants and desires have like controlled us to the point where we've commodified everything to be, and we've commercialized everything. You know, we're consumers. We're not fucking consumers. We're way more. We are not fucking consumers. Like I animal studies, I think is
yeah, consumers, that's also a way of identifying criminal,
yeah,
right? Like they lock up baby formula. Like what does that tell you? Who is criminalized? Poor mothers, racialized people. You know, if you're a consumer, you're doing it right. You're participating in the system of capital. If you're criminalized, you inherently cannot, right? And so what do you do to survive? How do you steal the formula? You know, um, yeah, you know, that was like one of the things that I was like, as we were talking about animal studies, it's like, you know, one of the things and the final gesture of Beast Meridian is, you know, nature sort of reclaiming these
yeah,
structures, reclaiming the land. And when I think of like, you know, and this is like part of Lord of the Rings too, right? Like the Ents that
yeah,
like fight the, um,
yeah.
So back to nerd stuff. But like, if you think of like, I don't know, like vines just like choking the Tesla factory, or like, or like, I don't know, like, just animals just like rushing Amazon warehouses, and just the land reclaiming the violences it remembers, reclaiming these sites of violence.
Yeah. But also thinking about like, how does their land reclaim us? And I know that's sort of an opposite view of like, how do we reclaim our relationship to the land, but also how is the land reclaiming us? I think of so many people during this pandemic have turned to gardening, have turned to a deeper or expanded relationship with being a natural being in the natural world in ways that explain our connectivity, like explain our real voids inside. And that real void is that gap, that becoming this Western thought, commercialized, droning type of being, when the reality is that is not who we are. And we feel that dysfunction inside ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Very much like, but I feel like the the natural world and our naturalness constantly calls to us, and it gives us dissonance, right? It gives us dissonance inside because we're doing all these other things. We're being human, right? We're being human to the utmost human ability, and we're forgetting our animal, and the animal then is haunting us in the inside. And
Yeah.
that manifests outside as well, of that dissonance, so we don't know what to do with it. Oh my gosh, Vanessa, this has been an amazing conversation. I know we're about out of time, and I want to end with just one last question of what makes you hopeful in poetry right now? What makes you hopeful?
Yeah. Um, poetry can become so professionalized, and like this other site of capital exchange, that I felt myself sort of becoming cynical about it and had to step away for a minute. I think that's why I turned to fantasy and video games, as like a way to sort of think through how I want to engage with language again. And I really feel like there is something happening in the realm of Latinx, Indigenous, and Black poetry specifically, where poetry is becoming visual, interactive, right? Computational poetics, right? Lillian Yvonne Bertram's book,
Yeah.
Anthony Cody's book, Borderland Apocrypha,
Yeah.
you know, Keith Wilson's, visual poetic things that, it's not a book yet, but, these things live online.
Yeah.
Poetry that is meant to create a feedback loop, right? Anthony Moll has this wonderful poem where it's a gender drop down bar,
Mm.
and the genders are memories of, moments where gender became a thing, right? It's the drop down bar is a lineated poem, and you choose a line as your gender. And then your result is that memory, that moment of gendering or misgendering or ungendering. There's, this really wild experimentation, and this like wildness of imagination and
Mm.
language, and like how it can interact with different media, that is happening, now. And I feel like the journal as such, the book as such, is becoming insufficient, just the way language is becoming insufficient, or is always becoming insufficient.
Yeah.
Like, poetry is going to live in our spaces. I did this craft lecture, and I felt so, I was so self-conscious, because I was like, okay, so poetry and video games, this character speaks in iams, and this like monologue is 4 sonnets. And I like, did like the whole scansion, like, and they were like, why are we watching Dragon Age, and why are we watching the romance scene? Like, and I'm like, listen, girls are an oppressed race. And I just think that poetry is starting to find its way into video games, into, you know, wheat pasting, you know, like it's just starting to live. It is, I think poetry is growing in this consciousness, and it's rebelling against academia. It's rebelling against capitalism because it wants to live. Knowledge wants to be free. So yeah, that's what has me really excited right now. And, you know, the vein I'm trying to work in, you know, spatializing language.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What a perfect phrase to end on is knowledge wants to be free. I love that. And it does. And in so many ways, poetry for me feels like a searching. You know, it's always a searching. It's a searching, it's a creation of that which could be an experience, an emotion. And it doesn't know containment.
Mhm.
It's an art form that really doesn't understand containment. And I think that's why it calls to, so I mean, it calls to me because I feel so much more brave in poetry than I do sometimes in my daily life. And I love this idea that it's breaking from its own definition, and not even definition, it's breaking from its own ideation of what poetry, where poetry should be and where poetry is, which is a form of Western philosophy, right? Which is also a form of colonization and white supremacy, that something is one thing and it doesn't want to be contained. It doesn't want to be. Vanessa, thank you so much for sharing your brilliance, your wisdom.
Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation, and thank you for like bearing with my nerdy moments.
I actually, I was going to say I secretly love them, but I don't think it's so secret.
Let's stop keeping it a secret.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But thank you for being here and sharing virtual space. For those of you who have watched our conversation today, thank you so much. Look for future discussions with other poets, including Jennifer S. Chang and Dr. Joshua Bennett, as we will continue to explore the art form of poetry and as a catalyst for social change. Thank you all for watching. Thanks for being here, Vanessa.
Thank you so much.